Welcome to our lesson on 2 Kings, Part 1. Today, we're going to be looking at the lives of 2 kings and contrasting those 2 kings. One was a false king, King Herod, and the other the true king, Jesus. And these 2 individuals could be no more different. They're just practically polar opposites. Few people remember King Herod, and if they do remember him, he's remembered for slaying the infants, the baby boys at Bethlehem, near the time that Jesus was born. Herod was the epitome of a worldly leader. He had worldly values, worldly thoughts. He came from a family background of worldly values. In fact, some of the Jewish literature of the day portrayed him as the anti-God figure. And so he has a very infamous past. Now, Matthew 27:11 says, "Now Jesus stood before the governor," that would have been Pontius Pilate, "and the governor questioned him, saying, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus said to him, 'It is as you say.'" So Jesus acknowledged Pilate that he indeed was the king of the Jews. Let's look at the chronology of Herod and Jesus. There was a very short time overlap between these 2 kings. Herod was at the end of his life. His health was failing. Scholars put his death at 4 BC. That's pretty well established fact. The birth of Jesus, we estimate, must have been around 6 BC, so that when Herod had the infants killed 2 years and younger, so he was trying to make sure that he covered that gap, so probably 2 years before he died, so probably 6 BC. Now, it's kind of strange that Jesus was born in 6 BC, before Christ. But it's not that the Bible is incorrect. It's actually our calendar that's off a little bit. So Jesus was probably born somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. So right at the end of Herod's life is when Jesus began his life on earth. Well, let's compare these 2 kings. Herod relied on his own ingenuity to get ahead. And he was a very crafty man. He had a lot of building skill. He was quite an accomplished engineer, and he built many impressive structures around Israel and even in other places in the Roman Empire. He was known throughout the Roman Empire as a master builder. Secondly, he played politics to get ahead. We'll see that he even had some of his own relatives, his own wives, killed because he thought they were plotting against him. And thirdly, he used religion to advance his career. While he's building a temple for the Jews in Jerusalem, down at Caesarea on the coast, he's building a temple to Caesar. And so he's just trying to please whomever to get ahead. Well, Herod's family tree is quite complicated because there are many brothers and sisters marrying and uncles and aunts, and can be confusing at times. So we're just going to look at a few things concerning Herod's family tree. In the top row, we see King Herod in yellow type there, and to the right of that, we see 5 names in pink. Pink indicates females. And so these are 5 of Herod's wives. His first wife, Doris, he had banished. Now, why would he do this? Well, Herod had married into the Hasmonean royal families. Okay, these were the Jewish elite that were ruling at the time. And so these were political marriages. And so to win over the Jews, he married into the Hasmonean elite families. So he has Doris banished, and then he marries Mariamna the first, whom is described as his favorite wife, the one he loved, but he had her killed because he felt she was plotting against him. Mariamna the second, he later divorced her, and so on. So Herod was a very threatened man. He had a lot of fears. His two main fears were that his own people would reject him because he wasn't fully Jewish. He was an Idumean. He was a half-Jew. About a century before Herod, the Jews, in their quest to build their own kingdom, revolt against the Greeks, they had gone to the southern part of Israel and conquered the Idumeans and forced them to become Jews under penalty of death. And so Herod's ancestors were forced to become Jews, and so the Jews never really accepted Herod as fully Jewish. Secondly, his second big fear was retaliation from Cleopatra of Egypt. Early on, their relationship was good. In fact, early in Herod's career, he had to flee Israel. Things were going badly against him, and so he fled down to Egypt, where she welcomed him, and then he escaped to Rome, went up to Rome, and was conferred kingship. So when he went back to Israel to establish his kingship, it took about 3 years of fighting. He always feared that Cleopatra, who originally was favorable toward him, but she wanted to annex Judea and make it part of Egypt. So now that Herod has been given kingship of that area, now she's a threat. He's a threat to her. And so he always feared retaliation on the part of Cleopatra. Well, let's look and compare Herod with the true king, Jesus. In contrast to Herod, who relied on his own ingenuity, Jesus relied on his Father's will. He submitted to the Father's will. Your will be done. Secondly, unlike Herod, who played politics, Jesus taught and lived the truth. His life was guided by the truth. It wasn't swayed to win over the political leaders of the day. And in contrast to Herod, who used religion to advance his career, Jesus taught the truth, and his convictions often upset the religious authorities. And eventually it resulted in his death. They were jealous of him. And so, quite a contrast between these two kings. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16 says, "Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi." So some time had gone by, so just to be on the safe side, Herod had all the baby boys killed 2 years and younger because he felt threatened that this new Messiah might take his kingship. So he was a very threatened man. And many of his building projects, and he was a master builder, were fortresses, so that he could escape to should his subjects turn against him, that he could escape there until he could get help from Rome. One of his first projects was his desert fortress at Masada, started in 37 BC. Herod took this natural outcropping of rock and fortified it with walls on the summit and had food supplies and water there. In 24, he built his palace and fortress in Jerusalem. In 23, he built his own, what would become his burial place, but it was also a desert fortress not far from Bethlehem. And then he built Caesarea, a port on the coast. There was no natural port there, but he arranged things and altered the geography there, made breakwaters so that there could be a port at Caesarea, so he could honor Caesar. And Caesar traveled by ship, so he had to have a port so that Caesar could come and visit him. And also, at the same time, he's building that port, Caesarea, and building a temple for Caesar there at Caesarea. He's building a temple in Jerusalem to satisfy the Jews. So it didn't matter to Herod, temple for Caesar, temple for the Jews, to Yahweh. Whatever got him ahead is part of Herod's strategy. Well, let's look at probably the most impressive of Herod's fortresses. Masada is located in the Rift Valley. It's a natural outcropping of rock, kind of isolated on all sides, with steep cliffs, easily defensible. And so this was a place that Herod fortified. But we need to remember it wasn't some just stark military fortress. Herod always did things in opulent style, luxurious style, 5-star. And so he had palaces here on 3 different levels. He had steam baths. He had swimming pools in a place where there's virtually no water around. The only water is the Dead Sea. He had food stored up where he could last almost a year. So this is not your stark military fortress. Herod did things to impress his guests so he could get ahead. Where is Masada located? Well, it's on the western edge of the Dead Sea, shore of the Dead Sea, just across from that triangular piece of land that we call the Lisan Peninsula in the middle of the Dead Sea. Here we see Masada from the northwest, and that white area that you see in the center of the slide, that's the siege ramp that was built by the Romans so that they could get up to the summit, so they could bring their siege equipment up. And the western side was only 100 meters high. We'll see that the eastern side was 400 meters high. So the Romans chose to attack Masada from the west. And you can see how this crop of rock is cut off in the south by a huge wadi, kind of slices by, disconnects it from the cliffs to the south of it. And then in the western side, there was also a wadi that kind of cut it off from the hills there. So it kind of sits by itself. Here are the cliffs on the eastern side, some 400 meters high. So the Romans chose not to attack from that side. And the steep cliffs provided natural protection. Very difficult for armies to get up there. And from here we can see, we're looking out over to the Dead Sea, we can see the Lisan Peninsula there, and also some water from the Dead Sea. There's another view of Masada looking from the east. We can see the snake path that goes up the eastern side of Masada. And so if you are a tourist there and you have good legs, you can actually walk up the snake path. And here are some tourists doing just that. But remember, in the time that the Romans were attacking Masada, the Zealots, who had holed themselves up in Masada, had escaped there, could easily throw things down, shoot arrows down on the Romans trying to come up the steep cliffside. Well, we're going to take the easy way up to the top. We're going to take the cable car, which is what most tourists do, and that will whisk us up to the top effortlessly to this 400-meter high cliff. Now, if the Roman soldiers could make their way all the way up to the top, they still had to deal with a thick wall at the summit. So their task wasn't over once they reached the summit. They had to breach a rather thick wall that was well protected by soldiers, throwing things down, shooting arrows. So it was a very easily defensible place, almost impregnable. Well, it wasn't just a fortress. Herod, in typical fashion, equipped it with every amenity, every luxury, so he could impress his guests. And on the north end of this outcrop of rock, carved right into the cliffside, are 3 palaces. You can see them here. One at the top, the next one, and the next one, kind of like stair steps. And he had a palace on each of these levels. Here's a close-up of the palaces on the northern end. And the view from there was just spectacular. I mean, it's hard to capture in these slides, but as you stand there on any of these 3 palaces and look out at the stark countryside and just enjoy the luxury there at Masada, I'm sure Herod's guests must have been very, very impressed. Here's an artist's depiction of the 3-level palace. The upper level had a large bathhouse. There was even a covered stairway to get down to the next level, because it's quite a precarious trip down to each level, and so they had a very protected covered stairwell to get down to the next level. The second level had a beautiful conical shaped roof, and then the third one had a courtyard surrounded by columns and a small bathhouse. So each was just the epitome of luxury. Here we can see the 3 levels of the palaces at the northern end, and then just to the right of the 3-level palace, you can see some structures there. That was the storerooms that contained food that Herod stored up so that he could have choice food for his guests. We're looking at the 3-level palace from the north. Just an impressive view from each of these levels. Now we're looking down on the 3 palaces, and you can see they built some stairs to go from one level to the next, but if there weren't those stairs, it would be a precarious journey. But in Herod's day, he had that covered stairwell to go from the upper levels to the lower levels. This is the 3rd level of Herod's palace. It had a courtyard surrounded by columns, and at the front, there next to the columns, you can see some colors. That was part of a fresco, and those colors have remained to this day, so very beautifully decorated. Well, Herod had storehouses to supply his guests, and his western palace could accommodate 900, almost 1,000 guests at one time. So remember, we're in the middle of the desert, very dry, very hot. Nothing grows in that area, and yet he can accommodate 960 guests in the middle of a desert area, because he had storerooms there, and he had vast supplies that could last up to a year if need be. If he was being attacked, he could hold out for 1 year. Well, this is the landscape around Masada. Very barren, very stark. You can see the Dead Sea off in the distance. Very little grows there. The temperature often soars to 50 degrees Celsius. You look for water, there's no water, just the Dead Sea. If you drank that, you would die faster than if you didn't drink it, because your body would have to flush out all that salt. So, how did Herod overcome the water problem? Well, we said that he's a master builder, quite the engineer. So he had a series of 12 cisterns, water reservoirs, built at Masada. These were huge reservoirs, and this is the entrance to one of them. So let's go down in this reservoir. And it's huge, as you can see, compared to this person standing there. The capacity of these 12 cisterns was the equivalent of 5,000 tanker trucks of water. 5,000. And so he had enormous capacity to store up water, not just for drinking, but he had steam baths, he had swimming pools. He could use water to his heart's content. Where did they get the water from? In such a dry and desolate place. Well, remember, we studied that up in the hill country, that's where most of the rain is, and that's a watershed. The water either cascades off to the Mediterranean Sea in the west or down to the Jordan Valley in the east. And so that water, when it rains up in the hill country, makes its way down through the wadis and eventually to the Jordan Valley. So Herod's engineers had aqueducts created to channel that water into cisterns built at the base of the western side of Masada. So we can see those aqueducts in this slide. We'll go a little bit closer and see how those, this is a model of Masada, and then those aqueducts led to some cisterns there at the lower portion of Masada, and they could store the water there. And from there, in order to get the water up to the top, it had to be hand carried, bucket by bucket, or carried up by people riding donkeys. So a very laborious task to fill these huge cisterns. You can imagine 5,000, the equivalent of 5,000 tanker trucks of water to get that water up to the summit. An amazing task. But Herod always did everything 5-star because he wanted to impress his people, his guests.